Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be looking at the subject of loneliness today, which I think we'd all agree is a highly topical subject right now. It's something that I think affects all of us at some point in our life, either directly or indirectly. And actually, it's so relevant right now, particularly in the sort of midst of a global pandemic, where our behaviours are having to be changed so much, and particularly how we interact with our fellow human beings at the moment is being dictated in a completely different way. So actually, I woke up this morning and heard that the Office for National Statistics had just released some data around this, which is highly relevant to today. And it showed that loneliness has soared since the clocks went back, which was I think really interesting. I mean, the data from the first lockdown had shown that about 5% of people in Great Britain, so that's 2.6 million adults, had reported that they felt lonely often or always, and that's about the same proportion of people as pre-lockdown. So this has now jumped from 2.6 to 4.2 million. So I think this is obviously something that's highly relevant to the situation that we're in and the pandemic. And the loneliness minister came out this morning to say that the next few months are going to be incredibly challenging. So I suppose from our perspective, from Positive, it's a subject that's really close to our hearts. A huge amount of our work is looking at human connection and how human connection is one of the biggest risk or protective factors around our psychological health. And I know that we've been doing a huge amount of work to look at how you can proactively improve your psychological health, and looking at this level of connection, particularly in a virtual world at the moment, is just so important. I'm joined, to get into this subject, I'm joined today by two experts. As ever, joined by my colleague, Dr. Sinead Devine-French, who is an educational psychologist and leads our product development and research and development at Positive. I'm also joined by a special guest, Dr. Tim Matthews. Tim is an expert and leading light in loneliness research. Tim came to speak to us all at Positive about a year ago, and it was absolutely fascinating. So it's brilliant to be able to welcome you to this webinar today. Welcome, Tim.
Oh, well, thanks.
Pleasure. Let's start out. Let's start out with a question around loneliness specifically. So I suppose, Tim, it'd be great if you could just share with us what is loneliness, and in particular, why is it so relevant to our psychological health?
Sure. Well, loneliness essentially is a form of psychological distress that people experience when the relationships that they have don't match up with the relationships they prefer to have. So it's a perception that the quality and or quantity of their relationships is deficient in some way. What it isn't is simply being alone or being socially isolated. People can feel lonely even when they're around other people, and conversely, some people can be quite happy with solitude. So it's a very subjective and individual thing. So people who are lonely don't just feel alone, they feel like other people don't understand them or don't care about them. They might feel like they have nothing in common with the people around them, or no one to confide in, or that the friendships they have are superficial, and so on. So it's a very painful and empty feeling. Strangely enough, though, loneliness actually serves a purpose in a sense, and it played a role in our evolutionary heritage. So as a species, humans aren't particularly strong or fast, but we are social. And sticking together in groups would have meant our chances of survival would have been considerably better than just going it alone. So loneliness is kind of like a warning signal that you are not sufficiently connected to those around you. And you can compare it, I guess, to the physical pain response. So if you pick up a really hot object, you experience this unpleasant sensation that's basically telling you you're at risk of tissue damage. And so you immediately let go to make that sensation stop. And you can think of loneliness as a kind of social pain response. It's basically an alarm bell from your nervous system that your situation is not good for you, and it gives you the impetus to try and reconnect with people. And in that sense, loneliness is a normal emotion to experience. As you said, most of us will feel lonely at some point in our lives, and most of the time it'll just go away as our circumstances change. But it's also possible for loneliness to go from being a kind of mild temporary thing to something that's quite pervasive and chronic. And I'm not suggesting that this form of loneliness is a mental health problem per se, but it can be quite debilitating, and it can have a cumulative wear and tear effect on health. And then loneliness becomes a risk factor for a whole range of mental health and physical health outcomes, including depression, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and early mortality. So there's a meta-analysis that suggests that the chronic loneliness could increase the risk of early mortality by 26%, which puts it in a similar ballpark to other well-known risk factors like, say, smoking or obesity.
Gosh, that's terrifying. And one of the sort of, I think, preconceptions around loneliness is that it tends to be something that it impacts elderly people. So I think that's one of the sort of stereotypes around this. Just looking at the ONS data, I mean, that's certainly not coming through at the moment. Can you share a bit more around how this affects different age groups and demographics?
Yeah, so that was a widely held assumption that loneliness was going to be something that mainly affects older people. And it's understandable why people would think that, to a point, because if you think of all the life changes that happen in older age, things like the death of a spouse or difficulty getting out of the house, moving into a care home, those are all things that can lead people to lose important sources of companionship. So loneliness, yes, it is a very common problem among the very elderly. But we now know that it's equally common, if not more so, in young people aged 16 to 24. And that's not necessarily a generational thing. It's not something that's necessarily a characteristic of Generation Z, because there was a survey done by the BBC a couple of years ago, and they found that people of all ages said that the period of their lives when they felt the loneliest was early adulthood. So it really seems to be something about this stage of the life span. And so I mentioned before the role of kind of life changes in older age. And early adulthood is another stage of life where there are lots of changes going on, because that's when people are finishing school, moving out of the family home, maybe going away to university or to a new town, and they're just trying to establish themselves as independent adults and finding where they kind of fit in the world. So it's actually quite a turbulent time, and many people find it quite difficult to navigate. So it's understandable that people, in that sort of age bracket could find themselves feeling a bit lost and alienated.
Fascinating. So when just thinking about that, so so you're most likely to experience loneliness during that age range. Is that right, or is it at both ends of the spectrum? And I suppose also, when are you least likely to be lonely in terms of age?
Yeah, so the two peak ages for loneliness seem to be adolescence and early adulthood, and then the very late stages of old age. So there's this kind of U-shaped sort of curve, and actually the sort of middle adulthood years are the times when things seem to settle down and people are least likely to experience loneliness, depending on, I mean, obviously life changes for individuals can change that, but the sort of average trend is for loneliness to reduce through adulthood and then only increase among the oldest old.
Right. That's really interesting. And just I mean, we've been talking a lot in previous webinars around we looked at anxiety, we've looked at stress in the last couple of webinars, and again that's disproportionately impacted on young people, and there seems to be a trend of the mental health issues within the pandemic. It'd be just really interesting to get your thoughts on the link between loneliness and particularly anxiety, stress, but psychological health generally.
Well, we know that loneliness especially in young people, tends to go hand in hand with a whole range of mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, conduct problems, self-harm. They're more likely to make use of mental health services. Also, we found in our research that lonely people find it more difficult to cope with stress. They're more likely to cope in more kind of maladaptive ways, like sort of withdrawing or ruminating about problems. And then also there's other research that suggests that lonely individuals perceive everyday life to be more stressful than non-lonely individuals, even if their actual objective exposure to stresses is comparable. And one of the issues there is that loneliness kind of creates this kind of sustained activation of the physical stress response system, which obviously it serves a purpose, you know, in the short term, because it helps you to kind of face up to the stressful event or stressful exposure and helps you cope with it. But if it's sustained over time, it can have that wear and tear effect on the stress system, which can then lead to downstream health problems of various types.
Amazing. And I think looking at how loneliness impacts how we see the world is something that's that's, you know, and particularly, you know, that level of human connection impacting how the lens with which we see the world is something that's really relevant to our work and our research at Positive. Sinead, any thoughts from your perspective on this? I know connection is a major part of what we do at Positive. It's an entire pillar of our program. You know, what are your thoughts from our perspective?
I think from our perspective, this is a topic that's just really close to our hearts. And I think when Tim first came to present to us, that research really resonated with so much of the work that we do. And what we're interested in is the risk and protective factors associated with psychological health, and how that impacts every area of our lives. But I think in terms of the loneliness as the topic, I think one of the really important things to say up front is to normalize the occurrence of it. And I think, you know, Tim's done that really nicely by showing that it's actually across the lifespan. But I think if you are watching today and you do feel lonely, just knowing that you're not alone in that. So it is a common phenomenon. And I suppose what matters most is that we raise awareness of it, and that we raise awareness of the positive actions that we can start to take to combat it. And at Positive, you know, we often talk about how, rather than thinking about our psychological health as well or unwell, we like to think of it as existing on this continuum. And there's lots of factors that can influence positively or negatively where we sit on that continuum. But I think what's clear from the science, what's clear from what Tim was saying there, but also from our kind of lived experiences of this, is that from the cradle to the grave, the perception of good social support is one of the most powerful buffers that we have. So it can really help to regulate our moods, our emotions. It can really help to quiet down the threat circuit, manage worry and anxiety. And good social support can really shield us from the knocks that come our way in life. And I think what really fascinates me and the work that we do at Positive about this is that it's perception, and that Tim alluded to this already as well. It's the perception of the social support that we have that's really, really crucial. So that kind of sense that I could be in a big group but still feel lonely, or conversely, I could be completely alone but not feel lonely. And I think what's really interesting to tune into is the legacy of that perception. So what it drives in terms of how I think, how I feel, and how I behave, not just now, but in the future as well. And I think if my perception is that I don't fit in, that people don't have time for me, people don't get me, then these thoughts, if I start to repeat them over time and they become more habitual, they can lead me to develop some really negative self-beliefs about myself. And those self-beliefs can be really powerful. It can really drive my future behaviors. So the danger, I think, and this is where our work comes into it, the danger is that I can get myself stuck in this cycle of behaviors, which causes me to retreat as opposed to approach others. And then that starts to perpetuate my feelings of loneliness and my day-to-day experience of it. So I suppose what we're really interested in is, how do you start to challenge those negative perceptions, and how do you start to chip away at those negative self-beliefs in a way which enables you to drive more helpful patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving in relation to your social experiences?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that concept of perception is so interesting when it comes to loneliness, because you know, we talk a lot about this and linking that to, you know, the cognitive mantra, and it's not what happens, it's the view you take of it. And Tim, I'd just love to get your perspective on that from your expertise and research. around the perception of loneliness, which is often doesn't match up with our actual levels of social connection.
Yeah, loneliness has quite a profound impact on people's perceptions of themselves and also of others. Because when you feel like you're sort of on your own, the world seems like a more dangerous place. And I talked about how loneliness is kind of like an evolved sort of survival mechanism. It's kind of a state of alert that prepares you to deal with a potentially unsafe environment where you can't rely on anyone else for backup. And so as a result of that, it puts you on your guard in your encounters with other people, because when you feel like you're on your own, every interaction is a bit of a gamble, and the instinctive fear of being judged harshly or treated badly is felt very acutely. And so as a result of that, there's a risk that your interactions with others can become a bit more guarded and frosty. You might find it harder to trust people, or you might be wary that they're judging you. And what can happen is that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it can become hard to build up that rapport and that warmth that you need to get along with people. And frustratingly, these are the very people that you need to be building connections with in order to escape loneliness. And so it can become it's kind of vicious cycle, and then that affects how you think about yourself, because you walk away dwelling on all the negative details, and it just reinforces those feelings of loneliness and your feeling that you just can't connect with people. And so it becomes this kind of feedback loop, and that's when loneliness goes from being that sort of temporary form of stress that goes away, to being that sort of chronic thing that follows people for weeks, months, or even years. And that's when loneliness becomes that real risk for health, because of that cumulative wear and tear effect on your biological systems.
It's really interesting. So the very thing that can support us around this, we actually can push against. And is that only the case in acute loneliness, or is that so that that those challenges around social interactions, does that really only happen once you're into that acute levels of loneliness, or does it start earlier than that?
I mean, your vulnerability to becoming trapped in that feedback loop can be shaped by other influences, individual characteristics. There are, pre-existing mental health problems can put people at high risk. Unemployment and other forms of economic deprivation, they can all be risk factors. So there are individual differences in people's vulnerability to becoming chronically lonely. But it's a situation that anyone has the potential to fall into if those sort of negative thoughts and feelings are allowed to kind of bed down. So breaking that cycle is really about challenging those beliefs about oneself and about one's ability to connect with people.
Indeed, and I think that links very neatly in the work we do around how we talk to ourselves in these situations, isn't it? And the judgment that we put on that. I mean, one of the things I'm keen to get onto is the context of now, and 2020. I mean, it's obviously a year like no other, and we've been forced into sort of social isolation. Social distancing is actually the key to getting through this. So that's obviously played out differently for all sorts of different people. But it would be great, Tim, to just get your insights into the effect of 2020 and the pandemic on loneliness.
Absolutely, yeah. So intuitively, you'd think, based on what I said about humans being a social species, lockdown and physical distancing are basically a direct violation of those social instincts. So you'd think that the pandemic would have massive implications for the rates of loneliness in the population. But actually, at least at the beginning of the lockdown, society actually did a pretty good job of compensating for those limitations that were put on our social ties. So we all started Zooming each other. Okay, it's not quite the same, but at least you can see people's faces and have a bit of an emotional connection. People started looking out for their neighbours who before they might never even had a conversation with. People were looking after vulnerable elderly people, dropping off their shopping for them. And then there were those collective displays of solidarity, like the clap for carers. So there was that sense of being all in it together. And so as far as what the evidence says, there's obviously loads of research going on looking at well-being during COVID. What it's showing us is that the great surge in loneliness I think people expected to see when the first lockdown happened didn't really materialize. What happened was there was a little blip around March, and then the average levels of loneliness stabilized and remained stable through the lockdown. I do want to emphasize the word average there. It was the overall trend, and there are going to be different subgroups in the population who fare better or worse. And actually what the evidence is showing is that the people whose loneliness increased during the lockdown are the same people who are at risk during normal times. So young people, the very elderly, people with mental health problems, and people who are already lonely to begin with. So there is still plenty of loneliness out there. What I think we need to be thinking about at this stage is what happens next. So hypothetically, we have a vaccine in circulation by the spring, and we start to open up, the furlough scheme ends, we're no longer in it together, and instead we have to adapt to this new normal. Some people will have lost loved ones, others will have lost their livelihoods. We've got a cohort of students who've just graduated without being able to say goodbye to their friends, and they now have to get on the career ladder with an economy that's been decimated. And that experience of trying to find work in a difficult job market is a very lonely experience. It's not nice to go for one interview after another and keep getting rejected. And then also that feeling of being all in it together. I don't know about you, but this time around, with the second lockdown, there seems to be a lot more distrust in institutions, a lot more polarization of opinion, and issues around low trust are very closely related to feelings of loneliness. And there's evidence that increases in loneliness during the lockdown was quite strongly associated with diminished trust in social institutions. So the picture could be changing, and you mentioned that article in the BBC this morning, which suggests that we are starting to see an uptick in loneliness as we approach the end of the year. So I think going into 2021, loneliness is going to be an ongoing concern, perhaps even more so than it was this year.
That's really interesting. I think there is this. I'm getting some feedback here. I think there is an element, isn't there, around fatigue around this as well. It's just it's going on for so long. This second wave doesn't have those some of those collective spirit elements around it, which were actually in a way, as you say, drew people together. I'm really interested in that concept around trust in institutions, because I think that's really relevant to to our work, and we obviously work with a lot of organizations, and just thinking about how they can consider their staff, their ecosystem around this, I think is really relevant. Sinead, just from your perspective, what have you seen? And we've done a lot of work in obviously organizations, a lot of work with leadership, also across the educational space as well. What are you seeing from Positive's work? What are the trends and patterns that have emerged this year, and what have we seen that's worked as well?
I think one of the things that's been interesting in the work that we're doing is just tuning into the small shifts in our everyday lived experience and reality that either enhance or diminish our sense of connection to each other, because we know it's such a powerful thing. In the teams that we work with, in the schools that we work with, in our families, it's so powerful to feel included and have that sense of belonging and connection. And for me, one of the really interesting things to consider is physical touch. And I know that this is something that I personally have really kind of felt over the course of the pandemic. And when you meet your friends, when you meet your peers, when you meet family members, and you want to embrace them, you want to hug them and say hello. And it's really hard not to do that. And it's something that we're holding ourselves back from at the minute. And I think, if you think across the different cultures, in some cultures, this is very, very deeply embedded behavior. And to not do it goes against the natural flow. And I think the psychology of this is really, really interesting. And Will, as you were saying, in order to curb the spread of the virus, we've had to introduce some really radical ways of working together, some really radical ways of interacting linked to physical and social distancing. And I think one of the things that's really been a lifesaver has been digital communication, how we can virtually connect with each other. But interestingly, that doesn't have the same impact. So it scratches a bit of the itch, but it doesn't go the whole way to really nourishing that sense of human connection. So what I'm interested in is how do we kind of enhance that as much as possible currently, And then how do we get those things back into the water in our day-to-day lives as we emerge from this, so that we can start to feel really, really connected to each other? And, Tim mentioned at the start kind of our evolutionary heritage. And I think, if you look at our closest relatives, the chimpanzee, and how they use touch, it's such a crucial ingredient to social bonding and to keeping a group together. And I think, our brains are wired in much the same way. So when we do hug and embrace and pat each other in the back, and those things that help us feel connected to our families and friends, those things are really, really potent and important. So I think it's about understanding how we can engage the virtual mechanisms of communication to do as much as they possibly can, and then think about what are the other social behaviors that can really nourish and enhance our sense of connection to each other. And I think with a lot of the work that we're doing with schools, for example, a huge part of that, when the teachers and the students came back in September, it was really important to see each other face to face. And so I think there will never be a substitute for that face to face quality of connection, and how that can buffer us against feelings of loneliness. But just to tune into the fact that whilst the virtual stuff is great, it can for some people maybe compound feelings of loneliness.
Yeah, that's really, I think your question there around physical touch and where we go in the future on that will be very interesting. What's the sort of legacy of that in groups, and how does this sort of change our behaviors and interactions long term? Very interesting. I also think just being in groups, we used to go to an office every day where we have all of our colleagues around us, and actually just being there, those sort of general interactions, that I think is such a buffering factor. It's all about the perception as well around loneliness, which is really interesting. And I just wanted to come to you, Tim, on that question around media and social media, because I know that's had some press around loneliness. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that, pre-pandemic, but also what's then been the impact of social media in the pandemic, because I know that's gone up in usage.
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, I think there was a danger of creating a bit of a moral panic around social media, because actually there really wasn't very much evidence that it was driving loneliness or other mental health problems in young people. And in fact, what the evidence shows is that young people use social media to build social connection and to enhance the friendships they already have offline. So they have, group chats, they organize events, they share pictures of things they've done together. So these can all be a force for good, especially in a time when, we're not allowed to kind of meet up in person. I think the people we want to be more concerned about are people who use social media as a coping mechanism to distract them from unpleasant feelings, or people who just passively scroll through their news feeds without actually engaging with anything. Those are the people who might find that social media makes them feel more lonely, but I would say they are the exception to the rule. Having said that, we talked about trust earlier, and I think during the pandemic, social media has become a kind of spreading around for all kinds of conspiracy theories and science skepticism and lots of political tribalism. And those sorts of things can be quite seductive to people who feel isolated or alienated, because they kind of speak to that sort of need to belong to something. So that's one way in which social media could be a force for bad as well as good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, given that it changes our sort of perception of the world and also how we interact with others. I mean, this is actually having an impact on political persuasion to some extent, isn't it? And there's been some data around that recently. So I sorry, you go, Sinead.
No, well, I was just going to say, just to build on Tim's point there, I think what's interesting is the way that we use and engage. So it can be, a force. It can be a force for immense good, whilst we need to be aware of where it's not helpful. But I think, one group that we've touched on as being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic is the younger people in society, for a whole myriad of reasons. But I think if we think about how we could engage social media in a helpful way to enable them to connect with peers, and how that might be a buffer for young people. And interestingly, Sarah Jane Blackmore, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, she's been doing some really fascinating work over the years on the development of the adolescent brain. And linked to that, this theme of us being a social animal, much of the kind of neural networks and the kind of the kit that we have to enable us to be a social animal is actually developed and fine-tuned in adolescence. So this period of time where, you know, from the age of 13 onwards, it becomes incredibly important and increasingly important for young people to interact with their peer group. So they will kind of disengage and detach from their family group to a certain extent and reorientate towards their peers. Their peers become much more interesting and important to them. And I think what we've seen this year with the pandemic, you know, when schools shut and they didn't have that opportunity to engage face to face with their peers, they're not having the same opportunities to develop those social skills. And they're not just social skills, they're all sorts of learning skills that will be really, really important for them over the next few years and into adulthood. So I think what this group of adolescents have that perhaps, you know, in years gone by we wouldn't have had is the opportunity to use social media or virtual forms of communication and connection to feel part of that peer group and to kind of share experiences and to support each other. So whilst we need to be careful and mindful of how we use and engage social media, I think you know, there is an opportunity for it to have real benefit for people to feel connected when they're not physically seeing each other day to day.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really important. And it's a topic that's going to continue to interest researchers and educational institutions for the future, I'm sure. I just wanted to come on to some of the sort of solutions and what can be done to reduce loneliness, because you know, Tim, I know this is an area of interest of yours, and you know, in the UK we have a minister for loneliness. So, you know, I'd be really interested from a sort of a research perspective and a sort of policy perspective. What is being done? What can be done to reduce loneliness? You know, it's really come into the conscious awareness of the public, I think, in particularly last 10 years. So it'd be great to understand what's happening in that space, and then I'll come to you, Sinead, on the connection front.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, the government launched a national loneliness strategy based on the outcome of the Joe Cox Commission. And at the moment, the government's strategy favours something called social prescribing, which is where you go to your GP and you get referred to some sort of group-based activity in the community. So the idea is that it gets you out of the house and meeting new people. And this is a strategy that the government favours because they see it as something that gives them bang for their buck. And then there are also lots of charities that are rolling out similar initiatives, organising, or at least they were before lockdown, so organising street parties and other sorts of workshops and get-togethers to try and get people socialising. Some local businesses also play a role. There was a news story about a pub that on Christmas Day opens its doors to anyone who's spending the day alone, gives them a free turkey dinner. So I believe there is a place for all of these sorts of interventions, and people do report getting benefits from them. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily a silver bullet. So, I mean, quite apart from the fact that we're strictly forbidden from socializing right now, we have to remember that loneliness is a state of mind. It's not just that you've got no one to chat to, even when you are around people, you're seeing it through a kind of negative filter. So people could go along to these events, but they might think, I've got nothing in common with these people, or they're judging me, I'm making a fool of myself, and just really not get the best out of the situation. And then there's the flip side to that situation. Someone could go along to one of these events, have a really great time, but then go back to an empty house and feel even worse. So you can't simply put a lonely person in a room full of people and assume it's problem solved. So we really need to try and tackle loneliness as a state of mind, as well as trying to fix the material circumstances that people are in. And there's evidence that therapeutic approaches such as CBT could be quite promising. And so the idea there is to try and tackle those negative thoughts and assumptions and expectations about social situations, and just preventing them from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy by trying to help people to sort of get the most out of their encounters with others and kind of break that sort of cycle that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I think that yeah, cognitive and behavioral route is something that we've really looked at, particularly around the connection piece. Sinead, any thoughts on that from a positive perspective?
I think just advocating an approach that gets you tuned into yourself and minding yourself in relation to this, and also at the group level, thinking about things that you can do to help support your team, your colleagues, your family members. And I think at the individual level, again, it's just normalizing the occurrence of this. So this is a common phenomenon, and what's important is that we take positive action to combat it, and also drawing attention to the fact, as Tim mentioned earlier, this can go hand in hand with anxiety, with depression, with poor psychological health. So if you are experiencing symptoms of these things and you're finding yourself stuck with negative, moods, thoughts, emotions, then it might be time to seek help. So it's just kind of putting that on the agenda up front. But I think at the individual level, there's lots of things that we can do to kind of look after the basics and ensure we get a good structure in place, and things that we can do to manage our mood on a daily basis. So things that we know are mood boosters that help us, and then the things to watch out for that are mood zappers. And Tim, touched on perhaps too much exposure to the media, to the news, social media. So just understanding for yourself, what are the things that kind of boost your mood and your connection day to day. But then importantly, I think keeping connected at the group level, and this is the work that we're doing at Positive with teams, with leaders in particular, and within education and schools. What can we do to keep connected? What can we do to keep this sense of we're in this together, and we're connected to something bigger here, and then to kind of break it up into different parts. So within your own bubble, the people that you can physically see, how do you enhance and enjoy that experience as much as possible? Because those are the people that can really nourish you at present on that face-to-face sense. And then secondly, how do you virtually engage in a way that optimizes connection between team members? So yesterday, for example, at Positive, we had a whole team meeting where we just built time into our agenda to have a virtual water cooler, and it was actually really good fun, wasn't it, Will? We kind of put people into small groups to have that kind of chance that you normally have, to have the kind of small chat and the how are you and what's going on for you. I think if we can formalize that process of that's actually really important, that really nourishes our team, that enables people to feel a sense of connection. So how do we prioritize that in a virtual world and make it what we do around here? And I think another thing to say as well is just keeping an eye out for the fact that loneliness isn't traditionally what we thought about. So you might have someone in front of you and not know that they are experiencing loneliness. It's not, the stereotypes. So just, it could be anyone. So any way so that you can check in with people, let them know that you're thinking about them. And, we've got these lovely virtual forms of doing that, but also the things that we can do offline. So like good old fashioned writing someone a letter, sending someone a postcard, the things that you can do to let people know that you're thinking about them, you care about them, and you're connecting to them.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really important, and that I think it is about that normalization, and this is just and we see this in all the work that we do. Is it's how you make people feel regardless of where they are on that continuum around their psychological health. So I think there's so much that we can do to change how people feel, particularly in this virtual world, because this doesn't just link through to psychological health. This links through to a load of factors that are so important to how teams cooperate, how collaborative they are, their sort of tolerance of uncertainty. So many of those sort of key factors are sort of boiling to the surface right now, and I think just normalizing the relevance of human connection and what you can do about it. And we at Positive, we have built this, we built this time in, but it's a struggle, isn't it? It's something you've really got to work on, and you've got to work on it even harder than you did previously, because it is such a key factor to our health and how we work as a group. Just Sinead, just quickly, we do a lot of work in with leaders around this, and I think these are leaders are under huge amounts of pressure. They and there's often that question we get, who's looking out for the leaders, which is, I think, is an important question. But then it's what can they do, because I think so many of these challenges come to their door. I think some of the people issues, some of the challenges around virtual working raises all sorts of questions around how you lead, how you manage in this environment. and particularly around sort of how you role model some of these factors. So just, I mean, any thoughts from that leadership perspective around how you can combat some of these challenges around human connection at the moment?
Well, I think two key things. I think from a leadership lens, there's putting your own oxygen mask on first. So the things that leaders can do, it can feel like a very lonely space. You can feel like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders and you've lots of important decisions, that particularly at this point in time, to make. So any way that you can connect to peers, any way that you can connect in terms of coaching and mentoring, and the ability to kind of normalize your experience and feel connected to the bigger piece is fantastic. And then secondly, what leaders can do to really enhance feelings of connection within their team. And I think never underestimate your power as a leader. We've been running insights with our Positive Insights team over the course of the pandemic. And what we're seeing there is that leadership check-ins are a really potent driver of people's feelings of well-being, their subjective feelings of well-being. So if you, as a leader, can make time to check in with your team members, and if you can kind of start to demonstrate some of those core psychological skills that link to well-being, and build them into how we do things around here day to day, how we treat each other, how we engage with each other, what we've found is that has a huge impact, not only on well-being, but also on kind of focus and productivity, and how well teams collaborate and connect with each other. So I think in the role of a leader, it's looking after yourself and then understanding the behaviors that you can model and cascade to your team, which enhance feelings of connection.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that trying to get that perspective taking as well, isn't it, for all of those and everyone being in a different boat, particularly, which I think has been a key message around the pandemic. And I think just on that leadership data, we also saw interestingly that those numbers of connections and the quality of those connections also linked into optimism, which I think is a really important factor for leaders to think about as they continue.
Just on that, Will, there's a few questions that have come through, and one of the questions is, how important is the feeling of hope in combating the negative impacts of loneliness? Tim, anything from your perspective in terms of the role that hope can play in combating loneliness? Because I know you talked about kind of loneliness in terms of an experience as well. So if there is kind of hope or something to attach to, how protective can that be?
I think it is a very important thing. We know that loneliness tends to go hand in hand with the more pessimistic outlook. And I mean, in our research, we see this in the context of job seeking. We find that lonelier individuals, for example, they don't rate themselves any lower in terms of the kind of skills they have for entering the workplace, but they rate themselves lower on more soft skills like leadership and teamwork, and they generally rate their optimism in terms of their chances of succeeding in the job market. They rate their chances a lot lower. And we talked about things becoming self-fulfilling prophecies earlier on, and I think having an outlook like that can potentially hold you back and limit you. So in the case of job seeking, it could lead you to maybe be less confident in seeking promotions and so on. So yeah, optimism plays a very big role in the kind of long-term trajectory and whether loneliness persists or diminishes over time.
So hope and optimism play a really big role in that then?
I think so, yeah. And then we talked about loneliness in the pandemic, and I think one of the possible reasons that loneliness is starting to increase now rather than earlier is possibly that earlier in the spring we kind of thought, well, hopefully this will be over by Christmas and we'll be able to spend time with our families. And now that we've gone back into lockdown and there's less of a message of hope, we still don't know if we'll even be able to get together for Christmas. And that's the 1 month of the year when people socialize the most. They try and meet up with as many people as possible, and the fact that might be taken away from us is possibly having quite a big impact on well-being. So yeah, the importance of being able to stay optimistic about the future is a key thing.
Well, thank you, Tim. I think that's a great message to end on. Staying optimistic about the future, which is can be tricky, but I just want to say a huge thank you to Tim. That was absolutely fascinating, and obviously Sinead as well for your input. Much appreciated. We are going to we're going to be back in early December. We're going to be focusing on this concept around connection, and we're going to be looking at connection in a virtual world and some of the practical things that we can do individually, but also with our peers, as you know, in our teams, and particularly for leaders to actually improve those levels of connection in the virtual world that we're currently operating in. So we'll send out more information around when that's coming, but it'd be great if you can join us for that. And do get in touch with Positive if you want to talk to us about any of the work that we're doing with organizations. Just to say thank you again, and yeah, we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.